Thank you for joining us today to discover another Top 10 Worst. Today's video is about the top 10 worst Ponzi schemes in US history. Ponzi schemes are infamous for defrauding investors by promising high returns and using funds from new investors to pay earlier ones. This financial deceit is named after Charles Ponzi, whose infamous scam in the early 20th century epitomized this fraudulent practice. Over the years, numerous Ponzi schemes have wreaked havoc in the United States, leaving financial ruin in their wake. Here, we will examine the top 10 worst Ponzi schemes in US history, which stand as cautionary tales of greed, deception, and regulatory failure. 1. Bernie Madoff, $65 billion Ponzi scheme. No discussion about Ponzi schemes is complete without Bernie Madoff, the man behind the largest and most destructive Ponzi scheme in history. Madoff, a former Nasdaq chairman, orchestrated his fraud over several decades, promising consistent and high returns to investors. His scheme collapsed in 2008 during the financial crisis, exposing the $65 billion fraud. Thousands of investors, including celebrities, charities, pension funds, and institutions, suffered catastrophic losses. Madoff used the classic Ponzi strategy, paying earlier investors with funds from new ones rather than legitimate profits. The sheer size and scale of his deception were unprecedented, and Madoff was sentenced to 150 years in prison. His arrest shocked the financial world, and his case remains the most infamous Ponzi scheme of all time. 2. Tom Petter's $3.65 billion Ponzi scheme. Tom Petter's ran a massive Ponzi scheme through his company, Petter's Group Worldwide, claiming to invest in consumer electronics that were never actually purchased. He promised investors high returns, and like Madoff, used new investors' money to pay off earlier ones. The scam began unraveling in 2008 when one of his employees exposed the fraud. Petter's scheme totaled $3.65 billion, making it one of the largest in history. He was convicted of 20 counts of fraud and money laundering in 2009 and was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison. 3. Alan Stanford, $7 billion Ponzi scheme. Alan Stanford, a flamboyant Texas financier, defrauded thousands of investors through his company, Stanford Financial Group, in one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in US history. Stanford sold fraudulent certificates of deposit, CDs, from his offshore bank in Antigua, promising abnormally high returns. His scheme, which lasted 2 decades, defrauded investors of over $7 billion. In 2012, Stanford was convicted on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 110 years in prison. The scandal drew comparisons to Madoff's Ponzi scheme and exposed weaknesses in the regulation of offshore banking. 4. Scott Rothstein, $1.4 billion Ponzi scheme. Scott Rothstein, a prominent Florida attorney, ran a $1.4 billion Ponzi scheme through his law firm, Rothstein Rosenfeld Adler. He sold fabricated legal settlements to investors, claiming they would receive large payouts over time. However, the settlements were entirely fictional, and Rothstein was merely using new investor money to pay off earlier participants. Rothstein's Ponzi scheme collapsed in 2009, and he was sentenced to 50 years in prison for racketeering, fraud, and money laundering. The case caused a major scandal in the legal community and led to the downfall of his prestigious law firm. 5. Reed Slatkin, $593 million Ponzi scheme. Reed Slatkin, a co-founder of Earthlink, used his connections in Silicon Valley to convince investors to entrust him with their money. Claiming to be a financial guru, Slatkin operated a $593 million Ponzi scheme that defrauded over 800 investors, including Hollywood celebrities and technology executives. His scheme ran from the mid-1980s until it unraveled in 2001 when the SEC began investigating his investment practices. Slatkin filed for bankruptcy, and in 2003, he was sentenced to 14 years in prison after pleading guilty to charges of fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering. 6. Charles Ponzi, $15 million Ponzi scheme. Charles Ponzi is the original mastermind behind the Ponzi scheme, which now bears his name. In the early 1920s, Ponzi promised investors exorbitant returns by investing in international postal reply coupons. In reality, he used funds from new investors to pay off earlier ones, and his scam quickly spiraled out of control. At its height, Ponzi's scheme defrauded investors of about $15 million, equivalent to around $220 million today. When the scheme collapsed in 1920, thousands of investors lost their life savings. Ponzi's arrest and subsequent conviction for fraud made him infamous, and his name became synonymous with this type of financial fraud. 7. Gerald Payne and Greater Ministries International, $448 million Ponzi scheme. Gerald Payne, founder of Greater Ministries International, defrauded thousands of people by claiming that his church's investment program was divinely inspired and promised to double their money. Payne targeted religious communities and claimed their investments were in precious metals and foreign currencies. In reality, Payne was running a Ponzi scheme, paying off early investors with money from new recruits. His fraud amounted to $448 million before it collapsed in 1999. Payne was convicted of conspiracy, money laundering, and fraud, receiving a 27-year prison sentence. The case highlighted how religious affinity can be exploited in financial fraud. 8. Lou Pearlman, $300 million Ponzi scheme. Lou Pearlman, the music producer behind NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys, was also the architect of a $300 million Ponzi scheme. Pearlman convinced investors to buy shares in his fictitious companies, Transcontinental Airlines and Transcontinental Savings Program. He used his reputation in the music industry to attract investors, including his celebrity clients. The scam unraveled in 2006 when investigators discovered that the companies did not exist. Pearlman fled the country but was eventually captured and sentenced to 25 years in prison. He died in 2016 while serving his sentence. Pearlman's Ponzi scheme is one of the largest in the entertainment industry. 9. Michael Eugene Kelly, $428 million Ponzi scheme. Michael Eugene Kelly operated a Ponzi scheme through his resort development company, Resort Holdings International. He sold fraudulent timeshare investments, promising high returns to investors, many of whom were elderly retirees. Kelly's Ponzi scheme defrauded investors out of $428 million. Kelly was arrested in 2006 and held in federal custody for years awaiting trial. In 2010, he agreed to forfeit his assets in a settlement, and in 2012, he was released due to health issues. His scheme is one of the largest targeting retirees in U.S. history, highlighting the vulnerability of elderly investors to financial fraud. 10. Mutual Benefits Corporation, $1.25 billion Ponzi scheme. Mutual Benefits Corporation, MBC, was at the center of a massive Ponzi scheme involving viatical settlements, life insurance policies sold by terminally ill patients for immediate cash. The company promised investors that they would receive payouts when the patients died, but MBC manipulated the life expectancy of policyholders and used funds from new investors to pay off earlier ones. The scheme defrauded more than 30,000 investors, many of whom were elderly and vulnerable. In 2004, federal authorities shut down MBC, and the company's president, Peter Lombardi, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The $1.25 billion Ponzi scheme remains one of the largest involving life insurance fraud in U.S. history. The devastating impact of Ponzi schemes have a unique ability to devastate both individual investors and entire financial systems. These fraudulent schemes often last for years or even decades before collapsing, leaving investors with significant financial losses and a deep sense of betrayal. What makes Ponzi schemes particularly dangerous is their appearance of legitimacy. Many investors trust their money to reputable financial advisors, companies, or even religious organizations, only to find out later that they have been duped. Moreover, Ponzi schemes often attract new investors through word of mouth, as early participants, who are paid with the money from subsequent investors, encourage friends, family, and colleagues to join. This can lead to an ever-expanding web of victims, as the fraud perpetuates itself until the scheme inevitably collapses. The tragic losses associated with Ponzi schemes serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of due diligence and skepticism when it comes to investing. Investors should be wary of any offer that promises unusually high or consistent returns, especially if it seems too good to be true. Additionally, transparency, regulatory oversight, and diversification of investments are key to avoiding financial fraud. Regulatory agencies like the SEC have taken steps to strengthen oversight and detection of Ponzi schemes, but these fraudulent operations continue to pose a risk. The stories of Bernie Madoff, R. Alan Stanford, and others stand as sobering reminders of the lengths to which con artists will go to enrich themselves at the expense of others. In conclusion, while Ponzi schemes can be incredibly damaging, history's worst examples have also highlighted the importance of investor education and the need for constant vigilance in the financial markets. By learning from the past, we can work to prevent similar schemes from causing further harm in the future. If you would like to see more videos like this, please like, share and subscribe to the channel. Thank you and have a great day.